Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est un honneur aujourd'hui.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor for me today to rise and to speak to Bill C-63, a second act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 22nd, 2017, and other measures. And as we say, this is an omnibus budget bill.
I wanted to also start with the big picture. We've heard most of the speeches in this place, Mr. Speaker, since we began the debate in second reading on Bill C-63 have not delved very much into Bill C-63 itself. I do plan to go into it in some detail. Most of the speeches, though, have dealt with the general question of how much we, depending on what side of the House we're on, like or dislike the budget itself. And I have to say that there are some big picture comments I also want to make. Debates in this place tend to focus from the Conservative official opposition members, berate the government for spending too much and adding to debt, and it's as though we've forgotten how to distinguish in this place between deficit, which is rising, and debt. Debt is a more permanent condition and unfortunately very hard to eliminate debt once it has been added on. We have not reduced any of the $150 billion addition to the national debt that was accrued under former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So the debt increased quite a lot in that period, although in the final term we saw a balanced budget. Deficit is an issue of concern, but not nearly as much as debt. So in looking at the deficit and deficit spending, it's clear that this current Liberal government was elected promising to run a deficit, although a much smaller one than the one we now see. Here's what concerns me, Mr. Speaker, on the subject of government spending and increasing deficits. We actually are in a situation in this country where we need more, not less, government spending. The strictures on spending that the current government appears to feel constrain things that need to be addressed come from, I think, an unwillingness to spend more than the large spending announcements that have already been made, which were needed spending. We need spending on infrastructure across Canada. In a sense, we've been like a homeowner who's deferred maintenance on the home in order to afford the other things we need in our household budget. But deferred maintenance adds up. And when your deferred maintenance is on your waterworks and your sewage systems and your bridges and your roads and social infrastructure like affordable housing, as those things come home to roost, you need to spend more. There's, at the same time, a deep aversion to raising taxes. So while there's been a lot of claims that the opposite side has raised taxes a great deal, the reality, which I do support, it was in the Green Party platform to reduce the tax on small business to 9%. That's certainly applauded. But we, at least in this corner of the House in the Green Party, are urging the government to look at the need to raise taxes on large, profitable multinationals. The tax on large business was in the year 2000 28%. It's now down to 14%. It certainly should be raised because if you look at the percentage of our total government revenues that come from corporations versus individual citizens, the portion that's on individual citizens has gone up while the portion on large corporations has shrunk dramatically. And as the economy is recovering, and that's good, there certainly is no reason or no excuse to not go after, as my honourable friend from South Okanagan, West Kootenay just pointed out, why not go after the big fish? The big fish are in offshore tax havens, the big fish are in large, profitable multinationals, and going after people who are seeking to avoid, or worse, criminally evade taxes should be a top priority. I note, and it's a personal story, but I think it's quite bizarre, that my daughter, who's a university student, reported to me that CRA is wasting tax dollars asking for proof of various items on her income tax return. She is a student. She's making enough money to pay much in taxes, or anything in taxes, I think, but she's being asked to provide proof of the cost of books. And I said, that's bizarre. She said, well, another friend of mine's doing the same thing. So I would suggest that CRA could adjust its sights on millionaires and billionaires as opposed to students. I think that would be something most Canadians would support. Turning to Bill C-63, I have to say that I read it with a growing sense of happiness. That will surprise people, no doubt, that anyone in the opposition benches. But when I pick up an omnibus budget bill, I still have a sense of, I guess it would be PTSD, from having read the omnibus budget bills in the 41st Parliament, particularly Bill C-38 that destroyed our environmental assessment regime and wrecked the Fisheries Act, and Bill C-45 that devastated the Navigable Waters Protection Act, removed our Inspector General for CSIS, and various other measures that had nothing to do with each other. Reading C-63 does confirm in my mind the strong need to simplify our tax code. When you talk to tax accountants, they'll generally agree that it would be wonderful if the Minister for Finance went in for root and branch tax reform to simplify the tax code, to remove so many boutique exemptions. And I do commend the Minister of Finance for removing a number of boutique exemptions. But the tax code, and therefore the omnibus bill that we have before us, is very complex around very specific items, such as straddling tax years and figuring out how to deal with different derivatives and the use of various tax mechanisms, such as going through trusts or going through additional corporations, and how we end up taxing. For the most part, I actually find myself wondering if I'm going to vote for this particular budget bill if we can make some amendments. And I just want to point out the areas that I like within this bill and the areas that I think would benefit from amendments. As an omnibus budget bill, I'm pleased to see that there's finally been some tepid, it could go much farther, move to eliminate some of the fossil fuel subsidies. This was a large ticket commitment in the Liberal campaign platform. Most of the large fossil fuel subsidies remain in place despite a pledge in the Liberal platform to eliminate subsidies to fossil fuel. This is a parallel and needed measure that goes along with eliminating the market distortions that are created by both subsidizing fossil fuels and failing to put a price on dumping waste into the atmosphere. This is the equivalent to having a municipal waste dump where there's no tipping fee. You're not encouraged to avoid dumping if it's free. And that's why a carbon price makes sense, but we need to move to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. The move that's happening here is in relation to changes in the Canadian exploration expense. This happens in Part 1 of Bill C-63. It will change Canadian exploration expenses tax treatment to reduce tax deductions that are available now from 100% down to about 30%. By the way this is structured has created an incentive for accelerated drilling prior to this kicking in 2019. So there could be an unintended but environmentally damaging period. I actually am holding in my hands, I won't use a prop, but I will refer to advice from Bennett Jones to that corporate sector to suggest that if any oil and gas companies can hurry up and start exploration and activities and get commitments in writing before 2019, they can continue to take advantage of the 100% deduction on capital expenses. I also welcome the changes to the donations in ecologically sensitive lands. I actually worked on this back in the day in the now defunct National Roundtable on Environment and Economy, repealed, by the way, in Omnibus Budget Bill C-38, where we worked to persuade the Minister of Finance of the day, the Right Honourable Paul Martin, to create special tax treatment for the donations of ecologically sensitive land. The provisions in C-63 continue along the road to clarify and improve that system. I'm not at all unhappy to see the follow-through on the Asian Infrastructure Bank. This is part of Canada's development portfolio. We still lag far behind the commitments that were made by previous governments, including every government back to Lester B. Pearson, Jean Chrétien, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, all committed that Canada's development assistance should equal 0.7% of our GDP. We're nowhere near that, but certainly the provisions around the Asian Infrastructure Bank are welcome. There are a number of other provisions that I was pleased to see, particularly those to the Canada Labour Code, to provide more flexible work arrangements and to give Canadians prescribed statutory time off work to recover after experiencing family violence. I would like to see those sections amended. I'd like to see that time off work to be paid leave. I'd like to see something for a single woman without children to receive some assistance if she's been the victim of violence. So there are some tweaking provisions in there. Very happy to see the new tax treatment for geothermal energy and an Energy Efficiency Act. There are many provisions to a bill of 275 pages, but I will stop there and say I'm generally pleased with the contents of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg. The honourable member for Humber River, Black Creek.
Mr. Speaker, and again to my colleague, it was fascinating listening to the areas that you so ably commented on. And many of those are issues that you have been talking about for some time. So I'm pleased to see that you are tentatively supportive of the bill. You know how important it is to be able to pass this kind of legislation. I'd be interested in hearing more about the tweaking that she was talking about when it came to the flex leave, that you were talking about the areas that we can better help families throughout Canada.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you. And it's always tempting as a member of the opposition, particularly the leader of another party, to spend most of one's time in Parliament talking about what's missing. Believe me, I fill up 10 minutes with what's missing and I'd like to see in a budget. But again, back to this family flex time arrangements with employers, maximum of 3 days of family responsibility leave, a leave for up to 10 days for people who've been the victim of family violence. I will say that already there's been commentary, and we'll undoubtedly hear good suggestions in committee, but I support what the United Steelworkers have said, which is why not have paid leave for people who are the victims of violence, and why not ensure that we include because it is traumatizing. It's obviously anyone who's been the victim of violence within the family. If your child's been the victim of violence, you can't go to work the next day. This is very compassionate and important changes to the Canada Labour Code, but we might want to go farther and consider paid leave. I certainly would.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Edmonton Griesbach.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to ask the member whether she had any comments about what the previous speaker had talked about, the $25 billion that's soon to be recovered by this government from tax cheats, and whether she thought that perhaps some of this might be related to any of the Paradise Papers people, including the Liberal Party's fundraising chair.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you to my friend from Edmonton Griesbach. We have had globally a real epidemic of the super rich deciding to be super irresponsible. The super rich, the 1% globally, hide wealth in offshore accounts, hide wealth in ways that ensure they are not taxed. And that is so irresponsible. You look back, by the way, I don't know how many, given that we've been in the grip of neoliberal theories of the trickle-down economy, that when the rich do really well, we'll all do well. Gus Speth, who was at the time the head of the United Nations in United Nations Program in Development Assistance, UNDP, he said, in that kind of context of the trickle-down economy, a rising tide lifts all yachts. And I think that's the case with that particular economic theory, is that what we've seen is that those who are doing super well are not paying their fair share. In the U.S. post-Depression era, where there was huge economic growth under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the top tax bracket was 80%, and yet they had stunning economic growth figures. So I will not comment on anyone personally, although I know that the honourable member for Edmonton Griesbach has invited me to do so. Anyone who's a tax cheat should have their assets discovered. They should pay their fair share, regardless of who they know or where their friends in high places may be.
Questions and comments? We have time for a very short question. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Longueuil Saint-Hubert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the leader of the Green Party for her remarks. She has a very inclusive vision, and I'd like to know if she's comfortable with the idea that, or with the fact that if there are items in this bill that weren't in the initial budget, then the Speaker should have the ability to split up the bill. I'd like to know if she thinks that's a good idea.
Député de...
The honourable member. for Spanish Gulf Islands.
Collègue, il a
Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague. He's right, as he often is, that in the new Standing Order 69-1, we now have a standing order that gives the Speaker the ability, the power to split bills into their various elements. So, obviously, if items were already in the budget, then it can be part of an omnibus bill. But those items that weren't in the initial budget, I believe, would be rightfully divided into various parts for their own respective consideration and votes.